Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Nama Blonder. I'm an architect and urban planner with Smart Density. Since COVID started, I started hosting webinars, inviting experts in the industry to answer some of the questions that I think are relevant and interesting. And I figured that if I think they are interesting, probably others would do too. So today I invited David MacMillan from the City of Toronto to tell us about the City of Toronto zero emissions targets and how the development industry is supposed to meet those targets, and how the city is going to help the industry meet those targets. I want to introduce David. David MacMillan is the program manager with the City of Toronto's Environment and Energy Division, where he focuses on low carbon community planning and implementation. David holds a master's in environmental studies from York University and is pursuing his registered professional planner designation with the Ontario Professional Planners Institute. David recently completed the Urban Land Institute Curtner Urban Leadership Program, which this year focused on expanding housing choices in Toronto's neighborhoods. So, David, with that, and I would just let you know that the presentation should be no more than 25 minutes, so very short and sweet and to the point. And you, dear audience, are very welcome to write your questions in the Q&A. This webinar is recorded, so I will share the recording with you. And from that moment on, David, the stage is yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Nama. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Like Nama said, I'm with the City of Toronto's Environment and Energy Division, and today, really, what I want to share with you is, our thoughts on how do we get to zero emissions by 2030 when it comes to new development? And really, our perspective is this is about market transformation. So here really is what we talk about, the market transformation cycle. And it basically the general idea is that it starts with policy requirements, which I'll get into, and the main one is really the Toronto Green Standard applying to new development. Then we're already starting to see it, but I think what's important is innovation on the business model side. So opportunities for the private sector to help accelerate sort of this transition to zero emissions development. And then what we'll see, as that happens more and more, is we'll see an improving business case, which we are. And then what I'll talk about is some of the incentives that we can offer as a city to help kind of accelerate that further. So back in 2017, which feels like ages ago, we were tasked with modeling, getting to 80% less GHGs by 2050, and that's relative to 1990. And so what you can see there on the left is, the modeling shows that we have quite a lot of work to do based on where our emissions are projected to go versus where we need to get. There's quite a large gap. And you can see on the right there that the big contributor is buildings, and a lot of those, of course, built, but new development plays a key role because that will add to our challenge. And then in terms of the specifics, really we need to go after natural gas. We have a clean electricity grid at the moment, so we need to address the fossil fuel component in buildings, which is natural gas for heating. So really the focus was getting to, in 10 years from today, getting new development to zero emissions. So by 2030, really all new buildings will be designed to get to zero greenhouse gas emissions. And there's other goals as well that support Transform TO. Focus for our team really is on this new development piece. And so the pathway that was laid out was really, it's really predicated on the Toronto Green Standard, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It's been around now for probably about 10 years, a little over 10 years. And in 2017, 2018, we moved to this, Toronto Green Standard version 3, the most recent. And really the key difference here with the previous versions was it set out this 2030 pathway. So every 4 years from 2018, the industry has to step up from the minimum requirements, to the point where by 2030, this tier 4 here, which I'll explain, which is the highest standard we set, that'll be the minimum by 2030. So today you can do any of the 4 tiers if you want. The minimum is tier 1. In 2022, tier 2 essentially will become the new tier 1. So the idea is that the industry is forced to step up every few years, and I'll explain what that means and some of the ways we're helping to do that. Then, a couple years later, Mayor Tory came back from the C40 cities meeting in Copenhagen, and I guess based on what he heard, he decided it's time for Toronto to accelerate. So City Council declared a climate emergency and endorsed a net zero target, and that's citywide. Which for us, it didn't change a lot. And when you look at the new modeling, essentially what it meant is we need to go further and we need to get there a bit faster. But in terms of new development, really the pathway was the same, with some perhaps minor adjustments to come. But so symbolically it's a big move, but really in practice, we're kind of already on that pathway with new development. But then a month later, there was a member's motion that council ultimately approved that said that for the city as a whole, for the city as a corporation, so our own buildings, we need to get to net zero now. So not 2030, but 2020, starting basically today. And so that really changed the game, because that's essentially 10 years ahead of time. And there are some significant challenges that ultimately translate to budget concerns. So it's really, what is the cost of doing this? How do we get there? And what are the implications? Interestingly enough, and this is where I'll transition a bit to some of the costing, is this applied to agencies. So when you think about the city as a corporation, we only build maybe a handful of buildings per year, if that. But the agencies, particularly Creatio now, is building a significant amount of affordable housing. And it's called the Housing Now program. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's the idea of building some component of affordable housing on public lands, city-owned lands. And so for us, the fact that agencies are included is a huge opportunity, because the pipeline really is 40,000 units by 2030, approved by 2030. The current pipeline is something like almost 12,000. So I mean, that's going to really, if we don't address that today, that really hurts sort of our path towards zero emissions. So working with Creatio, essentially what we did is we engaged an architect, an energy modeler, and a cost consultant. So the architect would provide key design inputs, the energy modelers would do a parametric modeling analysis, and then the cost consultants would do capital costing. And the idea was, we need to figure out how much it costs to get to tier 4 and sort of what the business case is to do that. So we focused, of course, Creatio and Housing Now is entirely multi-residential. So the good thing is the zero emissions building framework that we have, the Toronto Green Standard, has specific absolute performance targets for that archetype. And so basically, if you look on this graph here, it shows you kind of what the objectives are. So we need to make some significant improvements to the energy use, to the thermal energy demand, which is sort of about the envelope of the building, and to GHG emissions intensity. So we need to go low carbon. The approach to this really was, as I explained, the architects would provide some inputs to the energy modeler. The energy modelers did what's, it's kind of referred to as a parametric modeling analysis. Essentially what it means is, given a certain number of inputs, there's a number of pathways to get to the performance targets that you set. The stricter the design parameters, and then the fewer pathways. So as you can imagine, going from tier 1 to tier 2 to tier 4, there's fewer pathways available to get to that ultimate point. In any domain, though, you have to look at sort of 3 key areas, which you see here sort of highlighted in orange, which is your windows and walls, your ventilation system, and then how you heat and cool your space and generate hot water. Those are really what drive sort of will influence the designs of the building. And so what we found basically in terms of tier 4 design requirements, you really need to focus on the envelope and the mechanical system. Those are the key drivers to get down to those performance targets. So on the envelope side, you have to be airtight. And that's something that, it relies a lot on how you actually build the actual construction techniques. And then it has to actually be verified through blower door testing, after it's actually built and occupied. You also need smaller windows, but better windows as well. So moving from what is typically industry standard double glazed to triple glazed windows. And of course, a smaller window to wall ratio overall is very helpful. Insulation thickness for the walls, it probably has to be doubled, which is significant. And then smaller balconies as well, because balconies act sort of as, a lot of thermal loss can occur through slab balconies. And so that needs to be addressed. On the mechanical side, heat recovery ventilation is fairly standard today, but we're talking about very efficient, and we're talking about recovering all the waste heat from, the exhaust streams from the bathroom and kitchen to pre-treat your outdoor air. So that has to be done. And then the big one, and this is kind of the key to the carbon side of things, is fuel switching. So going from natural gas to electricity, again, using that clean grid. So moving to heat pumps. So based on the analysis that we did, what we found is that for a small, medium, and large building, so we looked at 3 specific Housing Now buildings, the capital cost premium to go from Tier 2, which was Creatio's original baseline, to Tier 4, the new target, we're looking at 4 to 5% additional cost upfront, plus about 1 to 2% in terms of soft costs. That's the estimate. That's today to get to Tier 4. And if you're in the industry where Tier 1 is still your minimum, it's about 6 to 7%. So we're within when you add in soft costs, we're within the range of 5 to 10% upfront additional costs to get to that level of Tier 4. Also important to note is that Creatio is building a range of Housing Now buildings, and a lot of the industry is building much larger buildings, and these costs tend to decrease as buildings get larger. So as we look at a larger sample size, that's something we'll be able to quantify. But for now, what we can see is the cost decrease with scale. So important to the business case, really, because these are affordable housing developments. There's going to be a lot of rental. So we're talking long-term ownership. Utility cost savings, operating cost savings start to matter, and utilities are a big one. And we're estimating, for the smallest buildings, at least $25,000 a year, up to $150,000 in the largest buildings, saved annually by avoiding, energy, water, and carbon costs. Not only that, with better construction, better buildings, we're looking at savings on energy system maintenance, which can be significant. And then just more durable buildings, so longer lasting and less repair that needs to be done over time. And based on our preliminary business case, we're seeing paybacks less than 20 years. When you start to add in renewables, we get into that 20 to 25 year range, but we're well within sort of some of the financing opportunities that the city can offer. So the reason this is exciting is because it's kind of confirms something that we're already seeing, which is there are private sector companies active today in Toronto who are making money as energy developers, which means that there's business models that already work. So if the capital cost premium was vastly more, it would be difficult to kind of I think make the numbers work for a for-profit company. But we're seeing already these for-profit companies, primarily on the renewable thermal energy side, being able to work with real estate developers to deliver on some of these objectives, which is fantastic. Their model really is they generate revenue based on the avoided costs. So on the equipment side, there's much less that has to be invested because you can shrink those mechanical systems, and then they get paid back over time through an energy service agreement. And again, there are several active today. I'll show some examples, and they're doing it both at the building scale as well as at the district scale. So district energy systems, thermal networks, and in fact, to bring it back to Housing Now, we're working with an energy developer at a site in Toronto, the Etobicoke Civic Centre precinct, where there will be Housing Now anchored by the new City of Toronto's office building, and there's going to be it's 3 million square feet. That's the scale for district energy. So we're actually doing this ourselves. So these are some of the examples today in Toronto. Various stages of construction. Some are built, some are just starting. But you have Creative Energy out of Vancouver, who's doing the Mirvish Village project at Bathurst and Bloor. You have Enwave, a Toronto fixture who's expanding now to the Well in the King West area. Institutions, again, the City of Toronto is an energy developer. So is the University of Toronto. But then there's some smaller private sector companies, Diverso and Subterra, who are doing sort of standalone geothermal projects. And then a more recent entrant, Noventa, who's doing sewer heat recovery with hospital partners, essentially taking waste heat from sewers and using that to decarbonize their systems. These are, with the exception of the institutions, these are private sector companies who are making money in Toronto today. So the last thing I'll say is, again, bringing it back to this sort of cycle is we have the policy in place, the business model is finding traction, and the business case is improving every day. But of course, depending on where you are in the industry, it's still a challenge. Like, no doubt, there are costs up front, and that's always a challenge. And so the city offers incentives to try and help to mitigate some of that, because again, our challenge is the same. We need to get to zero emissions by 2030, and 10 years will go by very quickly. So the fuel list here really is, the one we've had for a long time, commensurate with the TGS, is this development charge refund if you achieve tier 2 or better. Now, the value admittedly has decreased over time, and that's something we probably need to address. But you're looking at getting a 10% refund just by hitting all the tier 2 metrics. So energy, as well as stormwater and biodiversity, solid waste, all the specific requirements. But that's available to anybody who wants to enroll in that program. The next one really is a little newer, and it's the idea that the city can use its borrowing power to help finance energy and emissions projects. So we have sustainable energy plan financing, which, pretty attractive interest rates that of course fluctuate, but right now we're in a very low interest rate kind of situation. So we're about 2.5%, and that's fixed over 20 years. And that's available in the last 2 years. That became available to new development, to private developers. So that's something that we're actively, offering to the industry today to help reduce some of the costs associated with some of these improvements. And then the last one, which is not published anywhere, but it's worth keeping in mind if you're in the industry, is this idea that if you can avoid mechanical equipment, that penthouse that would normally be occupied by boilers and cooling towers now could be potentially freed up and reclaimed for something else, some other more beneficial use, such as additional GFA, which is of course very valuable, or amenity space potentially. And that may in fact indirectly free up real estate within the building itself. So there are ways that we're trying to find ways that are kind of win-wins, where we can get the benefit of better energy and emissions performance, while also making it financially or economically viable for developers. So the last thing I want to leave you with really is the key takeaways for you are that the Toronto Green Standard is the primary driver of market activity right now in Toronto. The energy developer business model, again, is there and is active to help support implementation. And then the business case itself is getting better, but of course, to address some of the specific financial challenges, there are these incentives available that I'd be happy to speak with anybody about at any point if you're interested. So the presentation will get shared. I've included a couple of links to some of the big programs that I discussed, but there's my contact information, and please feel free to reach out. I look forward to engaging with any of you, and thank you.
Thank you so much. Oh, sorry. Thank you so much, David. Okay, shush. Wonderful. David, we do have some questions actually, so it's really good that we have enough time for questions. Would you like me to read those, or would you like to handle it yourself?
Sure, I got them open. I can go ahead.
Okay. And
so
please read the question out loud, or just so we would know how to be aligned with what you're answering.
Absolutely, absolutely. So the first question is the built form required for these kinds of green standards is not really being permitted as of right in new master plans for different districts of the city by city planning. Urban design guidelines being written in 2020 still have huge underground parking and setback requirements. When and how will these green standards change those planning constraints by default? So, I don't want to speculate too much, but what I can say is that in April of next year, in 2021, our division will be reporting back to council on how is it that we get to net zero emissions by 2050, or in fact sooner. And I think what we're going to see, my guess, is we're going to see a lot of emphasis on, we know the technical requirements to get there, but in order to make sure that it stays cost effective, and in order to address some other issues that I didn't talk about here today, like embodied carbon of concrete and other materials, we're going to have to change the way that some of these buildings are designed and ultimately built. So I won't speak to specific requirements, but there will have to be adjustments in order to enable some of these things. Maybe the one specific thing I'll say, because setbacks were mentioned, the city of Vancouver allows for additional they reduce some of the setback requirements because going to passive house, you have thicker walls, and it won't make sense for the developer to kind of reduce that interior floor area. So that could be something that would be an easy thing to do that would make a lot of sense. And yes, it would have to be factored into the planning of these new areas to make it work. So I'm confident that we will do these things, but I mean, I don't have any specifics other than to say that it's going to have to be done at some point to achieve these rather ambitious targets. So the next question is, will developers still get the development charge credit once tier 2 becomes the new tier 1? Or will it change and now you only get the credit if you go to the higher tier 3? And the answer is yes to the second part of that question. So once we move up to, when current tier 2 becomes tier 1, you have to meet the next tier 2. And I know this is confusing, but essentially it's today's tier 3 would be the next threshold you have to achieve to get that credit. And this is where and we've heard this criticism before, is that because the development charge refund has not been set up to scale with the tiers, that it effectively decreases the value of it as we move up. So that's something that we're actively thinking about how to address, because we know it's a popular program, but it needs to kind of be refreshed given the new ambitious targets. So you in either case you'll have to meet that tier 3 in this case, and I hope that we can make it more attractive financially. The next question is financial incentives to nonprofits building new affordable housing and retrofits to existing portfolio. So I think, sorry, it wasn't so much of a question, just that, affordable housing for sure, given the cost sensitivity there. This is where, so low interest loans, I mean, I don't think right now we can compete with CMHC. So, our financing may not be entirely a solution. I think the ability maybe to, reclaim mechanical penthouse space could be attractive. In this case, even development charges, they often, get waived for, affordable housing projects. And so, I'm not even sure that rebate or that refund would be, viable in this case, because they wouldn't pay in the first place. So, there's nothing specific, specifically energy related for affordable housing, but yeah, we are definitely sensitive to costs. What I can say is that, in speaking with Creatio, they like what they see in terms of the numbers. They're pretty confident that, the industry will be able to deliver on this with still reasonable bids for a lot of the Housing Now sites. So, point well taken. It's something we'll definitely keep in mind as we proceed. Got a little bit out of order here, but what are the cost premiums based on? Was it a third-party consultant study? It was. So we engaged an energy modeler, an architect, and a cost consultant, all to work together to do this analysis. And so this is a cost consultant who is very active in Toronto with Toronto projects, and so they provided the cost consulting in this case. Another question, to what extent is the sustainability agenda, which I completely support, viewed within the overall planning and development landscape in Toronto, particularly the issue of affordability for all types of housing? That's an interesting question. Yeah, I think planning actually, when it comes to the Toronto Green Standard, they actually hold the pen on that. Environment and Energy, our division, is really focused on implementation. And so, planning, it's ingrained within the division there. And they are ultimately responsible for the policy that gets set. And that's done sort of in alignment with the Transform TO standards. So the good thing is Transform TO is citywide, and that applies to everything. And so in April, when we come forward with our report, if there's a conflict there, I'd like to believe that that's where it's going to get solved. So I think one, like I said, setback requirements, that's an obvious one, because there are some conflicts, as was pointed out in an earlier question regarding urban design. That's something that needs to be addressed. Otherwise, we may not hit our targets, or we may need to compromise on the Toronto Green Standard path, which is something we really don't want to do, because that's key to new development. And given how challenging retrofits are, it's very likely that we'll need to accelerate, go further on new development. So it is a key part of the the planning agenda, but as you can imagine, planning is a big division, and it's part of our responsibility is to make sure it permeates each of the different teams, including community planning, urban design, strategic initiatives, right? It needs to be thought of at all those levels. So yeah, so the point taken. Sorry, the bunch of questions coming in. I'm just trying to get. Does city planning have a mandate to allow developers to convert rooftop mechanicals to GFA? So no, there's no mandate. So this right now, really, we're trying this on a case-by-case basis, and the idea is if the developer is interested in this, when they come in with a rezoning, the draft zoning bylaw amendment would have to reflect sort of this, the additional height and GFA and unit count, and then our division would work with city planning. And ultimately, the councillor would have to sign off. But the idea is we would be along for the ride to explain sort of the importance of this kind of trade-off, or the value of it, I should say. It's by no means a slam dunk. It's not in official plan policy. So yeah, to be clear, there is no mandate for it. But we're getting the impression that so far, anyways, there's not a lot of pushback internally. Of course, additional units, height, GFA can always be controversial, but I mean, that's probably the case for any development in Toronto. So the reality is we're trying this, and I'm hopeful that it's successful, and we'll have some examples to share. What is the city doing to get shareholders and users involved? Because it comes down to end users knowing how the building works. Yeah, that's a really good point. A good question. There's another team in our division focuses on existing buildings, including engaging with property managers and tenants and building owners, because operations are absolutely critical. And this is a bit of a gap in new development where we don't currently sort of go back and verify performance, except for tier 2 buildings and above. Even then, it's really just a check that they were built as expected. We don't actually go back in 3 years and say, are they operating as they should be? And what we know in the industry is that after commissioning, sometimes things can really fall apart very quickly. And so a gap we're trying to close is exactly that, to try and make sure that the buildings are operated as designed. Otherwise, we lose a lot of the gains that we got from good design. And so that's something that we're actively addressing. What have been the largest challenges in the private development industry to this point as far as uptake goes? Have smaller developers been more resistant to added costs? I mean, I think, I don't know that there's a scale relationship yet. I think a lot of it depends on the sort of just the ambition of the developer in particular. Some do this kind of thing as of right. They have internal targets that they have to meet. Others, are just confident doing tier 1. That's what they know how to do, and they're okay with that, and they'll step up as they need to. I think what we're seeing really is, as may be expected, the leadership is really coming from the institutions, which have of course, a very different business model. The colleges, universities, and hospitals. We're seeing some additional leadership from rental developers, because the business model kind of is a little more supportive of those amortizing those costs over the long term. And so that can make sense. We are seeing some condominium developers who are already going for tier 2. They're already going zero carbon, by partnering with energy developers. It is happening, but slowly. And I think, yeah, my personal opinion is that there are some energy specific challenges, but it's just difficult and expensive to build in Toronto in general. And in many cases, energy is just, there's not enough time or ability just to kind of think about all the specific requirements that come with that to integrate it sort of with a typical process. So that's part of our job, is really to meet with the industry and find out how we can do that and make it as easy as possible, especially when it may make a lot of sense and it's just not something that they have the time and the inclination to do. So let's see, are you suggesting smaller windows and smaller balcony? How would you analyze or take into account comfort? So if we're talking internal comfort, Yeah, so window to wall ratio, there's an optimum. Obviously, light is important to comfort, temperature. So we have to ensure that it's not just the windows, but also the orientation to optimize solar gain. Because on the energy, you don't want to overheat or be too cold. So this is not to say that everybody should do a 30% window to wall ratio across the board. The point of the parametric modeling is that there are a number of pathways you can take, and they're very site specific, but there are common elements kind of to get to that tier 4, and window to wall ratio is one of them.
And it's also in comparison to current condos that are just glass floor to ceiling, and being inside is definitely not comfortable.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. On balconies, I mean, I guess I'm just assuming here that the question is related to just available space for people who want to be outside. So if we shrink balconies, what does that mean? Balconies don't have to be smaller necessarily. There are commercially available products that can thermally break a balcony to prevent that heat loss. They are expensive primarily because there's not a lot of them. So if a developer if the industry wants balconies, I think what we'll see is the market will respond with more cost-effective products to help have larger balconies that are thermally broken to reduce that heat loss. So it's just right now, like, that is not the case. So I think what we'll see, this is what I mean about the market transformation, and a lot of it is industry supply chain related. That will come, I think, as we accelerate. Our goal is to try to move that a bit faster if possible. But those do exist, and they are being implemented, just it's not at scale yet. What is Toronto's model for involving technology providers, engineering firms in this process? Will there be something like a preferred partner list? I mean, this is really driven by the private sector. We're technology agnostic, and also, as you can imagine, anything in Toronto has to be done competitively in terms of procurement. So we typically don't get involved unless it's for our own projects, of course. But so what we can do is, in conversation with the industry, share our insight about who's active, who's doing good work. We can share materials that are publicly available to show the kind of things we expect, but in no way can we kind of promote a particular company or product or technology. So really, I guess the way we kind of help to disseminate this is through our own projects. We try to lead by example, but the industry, it's entirely up to them to partner with whom they want, hire who they want, and we're there to kind of assist or provide any insight. But I guess that's about it. Yeah.
David, let's take one more question, because we try to make our webinars no more than half an hour. So let's take one more question.
Sure. I'll try to pick a good one here. Let's see. Okay, here's one. What would the cost implication for the owners be in 2030? Direct incremental cost of ownership, indirect cost of electricity resulted from massive costs to transform the Toronto Hydro's distribution system. I mean, look, yeah, the implications are correct. Like, if we fuel switch to electricity, the commodity cost is higher, and in general, the expectation is that as we electrify, demand will increase. We'll require more supply. We'll require overhaul of distribution equipment that is that is very old, and that will have cost pressure on the rate base. That's true, but it's hard to speculate. But I wouldn't discount the innovation over time, right? Like on-site renewables, battery storage, things like that will make it so that there'll be countervailing forces against those increases in demand, right? Electric vehicle charging, if that can be done overnight to help fill in sort of the gap or when demand drops, that may be a way for the utilities to earn more revenue without overbuilding, and then use that revenue to address some of the peak challenges that come from heat pumps, for example. So look, and then there's the provincial context that is sort of without our control, but really electricity and the way it's regulated, it's hard to speculate about what it will look like. But I think what we know is that we need to electrify to meet our carbon targets. There's really no other clear pathway around that. There are some tinkering at the margins with hydrogen and biogas and things like that, but we're really going electric. And I think, but we will have to be cognizant of costs, and you know what, actually what I'll end on is none of what I've said, precludes deep conservation and improving buildings just to make sure that we use less energy overall. So I think that's important to keep in mind as well. And so maybe Nama, if I'll leave it at that if that's all the time we have.
Yes, thank you so much, David. And guys, thank you. I see many new names for me that I'm not familiar with on the attendees list. So please connect with me on LinkedIn. And David MacMillan, thank you so much for your time and patience and for giving us. I'm already getting text of how informative and helpful this presentation was. So thank you so much. And if you want me to invite specific experts or topics that you would like to cover, just let me know. Thank you and have a great day, everyone. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.